October 1944. A cold wind sweeps through the shattered streets of Western Germany. Church bells no longer ring. Instead, artillery echoes across centuries-old stone buildings. Smoke rises over rooftops that had stood since the Middle Ages. And beneath the rubble, thousands of soldiers wait for an order that may never come. One city, one commandant, one impossible decision. Because somewhere inside these ruins, a German officer would soon face a choice that could cost him everything. Obey Adolf Hitler, or save what remained of his men. The city was Aachen, and Hitler had already made one thing perfectly clear. Aachen would never surrender. Not today. Not tomorrow. Not under any circumstances. Berlin's orders were absolute. Fight until every bullet was fired. Fight until every street became a battlefield. Fight until the last soldier was dead. Yet within weeks, those orders would be ignored. Not by frightened civilians. Not by politicians. But by the very officer entrusted to defend one of Germany's most symbolic cities. What happened inside Aachen that convinced a loyal German commandant to disobey Hitler himself? And how did this single decision become one of the most controversial moments of World War II? Tonight, we're uncovering the forgotten story behind the first German city to fall to the Western Allies. A battle that revealed something far more dangerous than enemy tanks. It exposed the growing collapse of Hitler's control over his own army. Chapter 1. Why Aachen mattered. To understand why Aachen became so important, you first have to understand what the city represented. This wasn't just another German town. Aachen was history itself. More than 1,000 years earlier, Charlemagne, the emperor who united much of medieval Europe, had made Aachen his imperial capital. For centuries, German kings traveled here to be crowned. To many Germans, Aachen symbolized the birth of their nation. Losing it would be more than a military defeat. It would be a psychological disaster. And Adolf Hitler understood symbolism better than almost anyone. By late 1944, Germany was already fighting a war it could no longer win. In the east, the Soviet Red Army was crushing German forces across Poland. In Italy, the Allies were pushing north toward the Alps. Meanwhile, across France, American, British, and Canadian forces had exploded out of Normandy following D-Day. Paris had already been liberated. Belgium was falling. The German army was retreating almost everywhere. Then came the unthinkable. For the first time, enemy armies were approaching Germany's own borders. Not occupied territory. Not conquered nations. Germany itself. That alone made Aachen different. It would become the first major German city attacked by American troops. Aachen fell. The illusion that Germany remained untouchable would disappear forever. Hitler refused to let that happen. Chapter 2. Hitler's Fortress City Order. In September 1944, Hitler issued one of the most infamous military directives of the war. He declared several cities to be Festungen, fortress cities. These cities would never surrender. Their commanders were forbidden from retreating, forbidden from negotiating, forbidden from abandoning their positions. Failure to obey could mean execution. The message was brutally simple. Victory or death. No middle ground. Aachen became one of these fortress cities. Its defenders were expected to transform every building into a bunker, every church into a fortress, every basement into a fighting position, every street into a killing zone. Hitler believed fanatical resistance would slow the Allied advance, perhaps long enough to divide American and British forces, perhaps long enough to launch a counterattack, perhaps long enough for some miracle weapon to change the war. But miracles were becoming increasingly rare. Reality was something entirely different. Many of the troops sent to defend Aachen were exhausted survivors from earlier defeats. Others were teenagers. Some were elderly reservists. Many lacked proper weapons. Food was scarce. Ammunition was limited. Medical supplies were disappearing. Yet Berlin continued sending the same message. Hold. No matter what. Chapter 3. The Americans arrive. The U.S. First Army had been advancing across France with astonishing speed. Following the breakout from Normandy, entire German divisions had collapsed. Now, American troops stood only miles from Germany. Among them were battle-hardened infantry divisions that had fought their way across Europe, supported by tanks, heavy artillery, air power, and overwhelming logistics. Unlike Germany, the United States could replace damaged tanks, replace lost trucks, replace ammunition almost endlessly. German commanders knew this. Every day they delayed the Americans. Another convoy of Allied supplies arrived. Every day Germany fought. Its own stockpiles shrank further. Still, orders from Berlin never changed. Fight. Hold. Never surrender. American commanders also understood the symbolic importance of Aachen. Capturing the city would prove something enormous. The Allies had reached Germany itself. It would be a devastating blow to Nazi propaganda. But taking Aachen would not be easy. Instead of bypassing the city, American commanders decided to capture it directly. The battle would become one of the bloodiest urban fights American soldiers had yet experienced in Europe. Chapter 4. The city becomes a trap. By early October, the people of Aachen had already endured years of bombing. Electricity barely functioned. Water systems were damaged. Hospitals overflowed. Entire neighborhoods had become mountains of broken brick and twisted steel. Thousands of civilians still remained. Families hid in basements. Children lived underground. Food supplies vanished rapidly. Outside the city, American artillery began surrounding Aachen. Instead of rushing directly into the streets, they isolated it. Road after road was cut. Railways disappeared. Communication lines failed. German reinforcements struggled to enter. Supplies became almost impossible to deliver. The defenders found themselves trapped inside the very fortress Hitler had ordered them to hold. What looked strong on a map was becoming a prison. Inside the city, German officers slowly realized something terrifying. No rescue force was coming. No massive counterattack was forming. No miracle weapon was arriving. They were alone. And every passing day, American forces tightened the noose. Still, Berlin demanded resistance. Still, the swastika flags remained flying over shattered government buildings. Still, radio operators transmitted the same reports. Aachen continues to hold. But beneath those official messages, confidence was beginning to crack. Some officers privately admitted the truth. The city could not survive forever. The only question remaining was, how many people would die before someone finally admitted it? Chapter 5. When every building became a battlefield. By October 1944, the Battle of Aachen had become something the U.S. Army hadn't faced on this scale before. Urban warfare. Every street corner could hide a machine gun. Every apartment window could conceal a sniper. Every basement could become an ambush. American soldiers quickly discovered that capturing one block meant almost nothing, because the next block was another fortress. German defenders knew every alleyway, every courtyard, every tunnel connecting the ancient buildings. Instead of fighting in open fields, they turned Aachen into a maze of death. A single squad could delay an entire American company for hours. Machine gun nests were hidden behind collapsed walls. Anti-tank guns were placed at intersections. Soldiers punched holes through the walls of adjoining houses, allowing them to move from building to building without ever stepping outside. The city itself had become a weapon. For the Americans, progress was painfully slow. Sometimes they gained only a few hundred yards in an entire day. And every yard came at a cost. Chapter 6. The American Response. The U.S. Army quickly adapted. Instead of charging into defended buildings, they brought overwhelming firepower. Sherman tanks rolled cautiously down narrow streets, blasting fortified positions with high-explosive shells. Combat engineers carried explosives to breach walls. Flamethrower teams cleared bunkers that refused to surrender. Artillery pounded entire city blocks before infantry moved in. The goal wasn't speed. It was survival. Every building had to be treated as if it contained enemy soldiers. American troops developed a brutal rhythm. Shell the building. Advance. Clear every room. Move to the next. Repeat. Again. And again. The destruction was immense. Historic buildings that had stood for centuries disappeared in minutes. Church towers collapsed. Homes became piles of stone and timber. Entire neighborhoods vanished beneath smoke and dust. For civilians trapped underground, there was nowhere left to run. Chapter 7. The Commandant of Aachen. At the center of it all stood Colonel Gerhard Wilck. Wilck was not a senior Nazi political leader. He was a professional soldier, a career officer, disciplined, experienced, and deeply aware of military reality. When he was placed in command of Aachen's defenses, he understood the significance of the assignment. Hitler expected him to defend Germany's first threatened city. Failure was unthinkable. Berlin's orders were explicit. Hold Aachen. No retreat. No surrender. Anyone abandoning their post could face execution for cowardice. But Wilck also understood something Hitler refused to accept. Military victories weren't won by ideology. They were won by logistics, supplies, reinforcements, communication. And Aachen had almost none of these. Every report reaching his headquarters painted the same picture. Ammunition was running low. Medical stations were overwhelmed. Food was nearly exhausted. Entire companies had been reduced to only a handful of men. Radio operators struggled to maintain contact with higher headquarters. Messages often went unanswered. Still, Berlin demanded resistance. Chapter 8, The Fortress Without Hope. As American forces tightened their grip around Aachen, the city became completely isolated. No meaningful reinforcements could break through. German attempts to relieve the city failed repeatedly. Columns of tanks were destroyed before reaching the defenders. Supply convoys were intercepted. Aircraft could no longer safely deliver supplies. Wilck began receiving desperate reports. Machine gun crews counting their final belts of ammunition. Doctors performing surgeries without anesthesia. Soldiers sharing their last cans of food. Civilians drinking contaminated water. Entire families hiding in basements that shook day and night from artillery impacts. Yet Hitler's headquarters continued describing Aachen as a symbol of German resistance. The propaganda broadcasts told the nation the city was heroically holding back the Allies. Inside Aachen, reality looked very different. The defenders weren't preparing for victory. They were preparing for annihilation. Chapter 9, The Order That Could Not Be Questioned. To understand Wilck's dilemma, you have to understand Adolf Hitler's leadership during the final year of the war. By late 1944, Hitler increasingly believed that retreat itself caused defeat. If soldiers simply refused to retreat, he argued, Germany could still win. So he issued stand-fast orders again and again. Entire divisions were told to fight where they stood, regardless of casualties, regardless of tactical reality, regardless of impossible odds. Experienced generals often argued for strategic withdrawals. Hitler almost always rejected them. To him, every retreat was betrayal. Every surrender was treason. Some commanders who disobeyed were dismissed. Others were arrested. A few faced execution. The message spread quickly throughout the Wehrmacht. Failure to obey could be more dangerous than facing the enemy. Colonel Wilck knew all of this. He wasn't simply deciding whether to surrender a city. He was deciding whether to defy Adolf Hitler himself. Chapter 10, The Human Cost. As the battle entered its final stages, the suffering inside Aachen became unbearable. Hospitals overflowed with wounded soldiers and civilians. Medical staff ran out of bandages. Morphine became scarce. Doctors reused equipment that should have been discarded. Children spent weeks underground. Many had not seen daylight in days. The constant shelling shattered nerves. Sleep became impossible. Entire families huddled together as buildings collapsed above them. German soldiers faced impossible choices. Stay at their posts, or try to rescue civilians trapped beneath rubble. Many did both. Some died attempting to save strangers. Others refused evacuation because they believed abandoning their position would doom nearby civilians. The line between soldier and survivor disappeared. Meanwhile, American troops suffered heavily as well. Every doorway could conceal an ambush. Every ruined staircase might collapse beneath their weight. Many veterans later described Aachen as one of the most exhausting battles they fought in Europe. Victory came slowly, measured not in miles, but in individual buildings. Chapter 11. The moment everything changed. The reports reaching Colonel Wilck became impossible to ignore. Entire sectors had fallen. Communication with several units had been lost. American troops were fighting only blocks away from his headquarters. There were no reserves left. No fresh battalions waiting to counterattack. No hidden stockpile of ammunition. No relief army approaching the city. Only silence. Wilck gathered his officers. The discussion was grim. Could they continue fighting? Technically, yes. For another day. Perhaps two. But to what end? The military outcome was already decided. The only remaining question was how many more soldiers and civilians would die before the inevitable happened. For the first time, some officers openly suggested surrender. It was a word almost never spoken inside Hitler's Germany. And yet, it had become impossible to avoid. Wilck understood what surrender would mean. He would violate direct orders from Berlin. He would almost certainly be branded a coward or traitor. If Germany somehow survived the war, he could face trial, or worse. But if he obeyed Hitler, thousands more might die for a city that could no longer be saved. He now faced the defining decision of his life, a choice between duty and humanity. Chapter 12. The decision no German commander was supposed to make. By October 21, 1944, Aachen was no longer a city. It was a battlefield of shattered stone, burning timber, and smoke-filled streets. The once proud imperial capital of Charlemagne had become a landscape of ruins. American forces controlled most of the city. German defenders had been pushed into a shrinking pocket around the city center. Every hour brought new casualties. Every block lost meant another group of soldiers cut off from the rest. Colonel Gerhard Wilck reviewed the latest reports. They were devastating. Many units had stopped responding. Others reported only a handful of men still capable of fighting. Ammunition was nearly gone. Medical supplies had all but disappeared. Food was almost non-existent. There was no reserve force left to launch a counterattack. Most importantly, there was no realistic chance of relief. The city had fulfilled its military purpose. It had delayed the Allies for days. But now, continuing the battle would not change the outcome. It would only increase the death toll. Wilck faced a question no German officer wanted to answer. Was loyalty measured by following impossible orders, or by preserving the lives of the men under his command? Chapter 13, Berlin's voice grew silent. Throughout the battle, Berlin had demanded only one thing: hold Aachen. But as the city collapsed, those messages became increasingly detached from reality. The Nazi leadership spoke of determination, heroism, ultimate victory. Inside Aachen, those words meant very little. The defenders weren't asking for inspiring speeches. They needed ammunition, food, medical supplies, reinforcements. None arrived. For many officers, it became painfully obvious that Berlin expected them to die, not because it would change the course of the war, but because surrender was politically unacceptable. The city had become a symbol, and symbols were often defended long after they had lost all military value. Wilck realized something many German commanders were beginning to understand in late 1944. The war was no longer being directed by strategy. It was being directed by ideology. Chapter 14, The White Flag. On October 21st, Colonel Wilck made his decision. He chose surrender. Not because he lacked courage. Not because his men refused to fight. But because further resistance had become meaningless. Accounts from the battle indicate that German representatives approached American lines to arrange the surrender of the remaining defenders. For American soldiers, the moment carried enormous significance. This wasn't just another battlefield victory. Aachen became the first major German city captured by the Western Allies. After days of brutal house-to-house fighting, the gunfire gradually faded. German soldiers emerged from ruined buildings. Many looked exhausted beyond recognition. Some had not eaten properly in days. Others carried wounded comrades who could no longer walk. Many surrendered with quiet dignity. There was no grand ceremony. No dramatic speeches. Only silence. The battle was over. Chapter 15, Hitler's Rage. News of Aachen's surrender reached Adolf Hitler quickly. His reaction was immediate. Fury. For Hitler, the loss of Aachen was not simply a military defeat. It was a personal insult. He had declared the city a fortress. He had ordered it never to surrender. Yet it had fallen anyway. The surrender reinforced a fear that had been growing inside Hitler's inner circle. His absolute authority over the military was beginning to weaken. Professional officers increasingly understood that many of his orders were impossible to carry out. Some still obeyed. Others delayed. A few quietly ignored directives they believed would only waste lives. Wilck's surrender became another example of that growing divide. From Berlin's perspective, he had failed. From the perspective of many historians today, he had recognized reality before it was too late. Chapter 16, What the Americans Found. As American troops secured Aachen, they encountered scenes few would ever forget. Entire neighborhoods had vanished. Historic churches stood roofless. Schools had collapsed into piles of brick. Hospitals overflowed with wounded civilians. Families emerged cautiously from underground shelters. Many had spent weeks living beneath the city. Children blinked in daylight after days or even weeks in darkness. Some residents welcomed the end of the fighting. Others simply stared in silence, unsure what their future would hold. For American soldiers, victory came with mixed emotions. They had taken the city, but the cost had been enormous. Urban combat had proven to be among the most dangerous forms of warfare. Every street had demanded blood. Chapter 17, A Lesson the Allies Could Not Ignore. The Battle of Aachen taught American commanders valuable and painful lessons. They learned that capturing cities could consume tremendous amounts of time and manpower, even when surrounded, even when isolated. Determined defenders could slow an entire army. These lessons influenced later operations against the Siegfried Line and during the advance toward the Rhine River. American units refined their tactics. Engineers worked more closely with infantry. Tanks were integrated into street fighting more effectively. Artillery coordination improved. Each battle made the army more experienced. But every improvement came at a terrible cost, because each lesson had first been written in blood. Chapter 18, The Beginning of the End. The fall of Aachen marked more than the capture of a city. It marked the beginning of Germany's collapse from within. For years, Nazi propaganda had promised that enemy armies would never fight inside Germany. Now they had. For years, Hitler insisted that unwavering determination alone could defeat overwhelming odds. Aachen proved otherwise. The city's defenders had fought with determination. They had obeyed orders. They had sacrificed enormously. Yet the city still fell. Reality had defeated ideology. And many German officers quietly recognized that fact. Although they continued fighting for months, confidence in ultimate victory had been deeply shaken. The road into Germany was now open. The Rhine River, the last great natural barrier protecting the heart of the Reich, lay ahead. The Allies were coming. And everyone knew it. Chapter 19. What happened to Colonel Gerhard Wilck? When the firing finally stopped, Colonel Gerhard Wilck walked into captivity. Like thousands of other German officers captured during the war, he became a prisoner of the United States Army. Unlike many Nazi political leaders, Wilck was viewed primarily as a professional military officer rather than a key figure in the Nazi regime. After the war, he was eventually released and returned to civilian life. His decision at Aachen would remain controversial. To die-hard Nazi loyalists, surrendering a designated fortress city violated Hitler's explicit orders. But to many military historians, his decision reflected a commander facing an impossible reality. By the time Aachen surrendered, the city had been completely surrounded. His troops were exhausted. Supplies were gone. Reinforcements were impossible. Continuing to fight would almost certainly have produced more casualties without changing the outcome. Today, many historians argue that Wilck's surrender likely prevented additional unnecessary deaths among both German soldiers and civilians. Chapter 20, The Price of a Symbol. Hitler believed symbols could inspire victory. That's why Aachen mattered so much. It wasn't simply a city on a map. It represented Germany's past, its history, its national pride. But symbols cannot stop artillery. They cannot replace ammunition. They cannot feed hungry soldiers. And they cannot change military reality. The defense of Aachen delayed the Allied advance for a short time. But it did not stop it. Instead, the battle consumed thousands of lives and left one of Germany's oldest cities in ruins. The destruction raised a question that still echoes through military history. When does defending a symbol become sacrificing lives for an illusion? Chapter 21, A Turning Point for the U.S. Army. For the United States Army, Aachen became a defining experience. It was the first time American troops captured a major city inside Germany itself. That achievement carried enormous psychological significance. For years, Nazi propaganda had portrayed Germany as an impenetrable fortress. Now, American soldiers had broken through. The victory sent a powerful message, not only to the Allies but also to the German people. The war had reached Germany's doorstep. The road ahead would still be long. The fighting would remain brutal. The Battle of the Bulge was only weeks away. The Rhine River still had to be crossed. And Berlin itself remained hundreds of miles to the east. But after Aachen, there was little doubt that the Allies had gained the strategic momentum. Chapter 22, The Lessons of Aachen. Military academies still study the Battle of Aachen today. Not because it was the largest battle of World War II. Not because it involved the most soldiers. But because it highlighted several timeless lessons. First, urban warfare is among the most difficult forms of combat. Even a relatively small defending force can delay a much larger attacker. Second, logistics often decide battles before the shooting begins. Without ammunition, food, medical care, and reinforcements, even the bravest soldiers cannot fight indefinitely. Third, leadership sometimes requires acknowledging reality instead of clinging to impossible orders. Colonel Wilck's decision remains a subject of debate, but it illustrates the burden commanders carry when military duty collides with human cost. Chapter 23, The Collapse of Hitler's Strategy. The fall of Aachen also exposed a deeper problem within Nazi Germany. By late 1944, Hitler's military strategy relied increasingly on stand-fast orders. Cities were declared fortresses. Units were forbidden to retreat. Commanders were instructed to fight to the last man. In some places, these orders delayed the Allies. In many others, they resulted in isolated garrisons being destroyed without altering the broader course of the war. As Germany's situation worsened, experienced officers found themselves trapped between two impossible choices: obey unrealistic orders, or preserve the lives of their soldiers. Aachen became one of the earliest and clearest examples of that dilemma. The conflict between ideology and military reality would only grow sharper during the final months of the war. Chapter 24. The City That Rose Again. Today, if you walk through Aachen, you'll find a city transformed. Its famous cathedral still stands, a UNESCO World Heritage Site that survived the war despite damage. Historic squares have been rebuilt. Students fill the streets, thanks to one of Germany's leading technical universities. Tourists visit cafes where artillery once echoed. Children play in parks that were once battlefields. The scars of war remain in museums, memorials, and preserved ruins, but the city itself has become a symbol of recovery rather than destruction. Aachen's story reminds us that even after immense devastation, communities can rebuild. The order that could not save a city. History often remembers battles by their victors. But sometimes, the most important stories are about the choices made when victory is no longer possible. Colonel Gerhard Wilck did not win the Battle of Aachen. The United States Army captured the city. Hitler's orders were not fulfilled. Yet the decision to surrender forces us to confront a difficult question. What is the true duty of a commander? Is it absolute obedience? Or is it protecting lives when the outcome can no longer be changed? There is no simple answer. Some will argue that a soldier's duty is to obey. Others will argue that leadership demands moral judgment when orders no longer serve any military purpose. That debate continues among historians to this day. What is certain is this: the fall of Aachen marked a turning point. It shattered the myth that Germany's homeland could remain untouched. It demonstrated the enormous cost of urban warfare. And it revealed the widening gap between Hitler's expectations and the grim realities faced by his commanders on the front lines. Within 7 months of Aachen's surrender, Nazi Germany itself would collapse. Berlin would fall. Adolf Hitler would be dead. The war in Europe would come to an end. But in October 1944, inside the ruins of one ancient city, those final chapters were only beginning to unfold. Sometimes, history changes not with a triumphant charge, but with a single decision to stop fighting. And in the shattered streets of Aachen, that decision echoed far beyond the battlefield. If you enjoyed this documentary and want more deeply researched stories from World War II, covering forgotten battles, impossible decisions, and the people behind history, be sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next documentary.